Good evening, everyone.
Hi,
How's everyone doing tonight?
Great.
Great. Welcome to our first in-person Ocean Currents lecture since summer of 2019.
Oh, wow.
So welcome back. Thank you for joining us. Thank you online for joining us as well. So we have it's not our first hybrid, I don't think, but we have some people online. We have people in the room, which is fantastic. Good evening. My name is Chris Petrone. I'm the director of the Delaware Sea Grant Marine Advisory Service. That's our a center within the College of Earth, Ocean, Environment that does extension education, and we fund research as well. It's my pleasure to welcome you back. We have 8 great ocean currents lectures coming up this summer, every 2 weeks, every other Thursday through August. And I'm excited to introduce our first ocean current speaker. Where am I? There we are. Kate Fleming. I'm standing really close to you right now to be on camera. Kate Fleming is our coastal ecology specialist with Delaware Sea Grant. She's been with Delaware Sea Grant in the college for almost 4 years. And before that was with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. She's got not one, but 2 masters. One in, I'll have to look this up. One in conservation biology from the University of New South Wales and Victoria University of Wellington, and a second master's in natural resources from Delaware State University. She coordinates a ton of really cool projects, including our derelict crab pot recovery project, which you may have heard in Ocean Currents lecture two summers ago. But tonight she's going to talk about something a little different, one of our most important natural resources here in the great state of Delaware. So without further ado, Kate Fleming.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to take my mask off to speak tonight. And as Chris said, I am Kate. I'm Delaware Sea Grant's coastal ecology specialist, and welcome. This is exciting. I think this might be my second in-person lecture I've done since the pandemic, so it's exciting for me too. So I'm going to talk, I was invited to come here tonight and talk to you all about Delaware Bay horseshoe crabs and how and why we count them. So I want to start out with just asking, is there anyone here that isn't familiar with the widespread horseshoe crab spawning in the area? Is this new to anybody? Okay. And are you all familiar with the fact that there's a widespread collaborative effort to document the spawning? Is anyone not familiar with that? Is that new to you? Cool. That's great. So I'm not originally from Delaware. So I wasn't familiar with this until I came to Delaware myself, which is why I ask. I know we got new people here all the time. I came to Delaware in 2012, and I don't think I actually went to see a spawning event myself until maybe 2015. So it took a few years, but it's very, very cool if you haven't seen it. And I recommend, I'm going to help you all figure out how to go out and see it if you haven't. And I recommend you do. But there's a widespread collaborative effort across the region, the Delaware Bayshore region, to document the horseshoe crab spawning activity. It takes place across 25 sites and every year they're oriented across 12 nights in May and June on the full and new moon, and then a couple days before and a couple days after. So we actually just finished that's three volunteers. That's 3 surveys per lunar cycle is what we call them. And there's 4 total. So that's a total of 12. We just finished rounds of our first lunar cycle surveys. Last night, I got home at like 2 in the morning. So that happens sometimes because their peak numbers spawn at night. And a lot of these sites that implement horseshoe crab spawning surveys use the support of community scientists. Not all of them. Some are professional scientists that implement these surveys, but then we have nonprofits, we have myself at the University of Delaware, community groups, and there's lots of different organizations that are responsible for implementing these surveys. Okay, so what I want to do is just start out with a little bit of background on this species to orient ourselves, and then we're going to talk about why the species is so important, and then I'm going to get into how we actually document them through the horseshoe crab spawning survey. So when we talk about horseshoe crabs in this area, we're talking about the Atlantic horseshoe crab. This is one of 4 species that occurs worldwide and the only species that occurs in North America, with a range from the Newfoundland waters all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula. And this area, the Delaware Bay Shore region, is really the population center for this species. We have an estimated 30 million spawning horseshoe crabs in our population. The most recent stock assessment came out and determined that this population is in stable condition. So lots and lots of horseshoe crabs here. And really important then for the identity of our area. So it sounds like you're all familiar with this animal, so this should be familiar. They have a really distinctive look, very prehistoric looking, and they have a fossil record that dates back millions of years. So they are exactly the same as they were 250 million years ago. They haven't evolved. And although the name might imply that they are a type of crustacean, they're not. They're actually more closely related to spiders and scorpions. So are you all familiar with how scorpion exoskeletons glow in UV light, like in a black light? Okay, well they do, and I guess that's something that horseshoe crabs also do, so kind of similar. My husband and I went camping a few years ago out west, and a friend gave us a black light and said, hey, you might want to check your sleeping bag for scorpions. So we were out there every night looking for the glowing exoskeleton. So horseshoe crabs have the same properties, and this photo was actually taken by Chris when he was out on site with us a few years ago. He had the foresight to bring the black light out and take this really cool photo. So like spiders, horseshoe crabs' bodies are broken into 2 main parts, where we have a head, the prosoma. It contains their brain and their mouths for eating. And then the abdomen, or pistosoma, which contains their muscles for movement and their gills for breathing. And then horseshoe crabs also have a tail, or telson. And the tail they use, it's really important, they use it to help them reorient themselves when they find themselves on their back. So I'm sure you all, if you've been walking Delaware beaches, have seen horseshoe crabs stranded on their backs. This happens during the spawning events. They don't have a lot of control over their bodies, and they get flipped around in the surf. And so when they get knocked upside down, they can use their tails to actually leverage themselves back onto their legs. So if you ever want to help a horseshoe crab back onto its legs, just handle it by its head and never its tail, because it needs its tail to survive, and it's very vulnerable to breakage. So the underside of the horseshoe crab reveals their walking legs. So horseshoe crabs are actually more crawlers than swimmers. Technically, when they swim on their backs. Although I'll say I've never seen a horseshoe crab swimming. When I find one on its back, it's usually dead. But I've seen videos of it. Horseshoe crabs are more crawlers along the bottom of the seafloor, where they feed on benthic animals, crustaceans, bivalves. They really like blue mussels. And I'll just point out that they have a set of small pinchers that they use to take those food items and actually place it into their mouths. And then I also want to point out their first set of pedipalps. So this is important because male and female horseshoe crabs actually have differences in these claws. So females, their legs are all pointy. They're all the same. And the males have what we sometimes call club claws or boxing glove claws. I have a better picture here where hopefully you can see. I think this part is a little bit easier to see. They're shaped in a way that allows the horseshoe crab to clasp onto the backs of females. So you've probably seen, if you've been seeing horseshoe crabs on our beaches, that sometimes horseshoe crabs are in this position called amplexus, where the males are clasped behind the females. They will sometimes do this months in advance of the spawning season to prepare for the spawning season and arrive to our beaches already attached. And what is happening is the male is trying to get in the proper position to be able to fertilize all of the eggs that the female is laying and depositing in nests that she creates in depressions in the sand. So Not all males arrive to the beach attached to the female, however, and they're still very important. They're still capable of fertilizing eggs. And sometimes they're actually capable, they're called satellite males when they're not attached. And sometimes they're capable of fertilizing the majority of eggs in a nest. And so it's really important that there are lots of male horseshoe crabs on the beach in order to fertilize all of the eggs that the females are laying. So I've just kind of diagrammed this out so you can kind of see what's going on. When we're out there on the beaches documenting horseshoe crabs, it can be kind of crazy and hard to tease apart, especially with the surf coming in, but you get practice at it. And this one is actually, I think, fairly straightforward what's going on. Here's another look at what we might see. Sometimes you won't see much of the horseshoe crab at all. When the horseshoe crab is buried like that in the sand, that's a female. She's deep in the sand, and all of those other horseshoe crabs, we know they're males just based on the way they're oriented around her. And sometimes we can actually tell that there's a female even when we don't see her, just by mere fact of there's a lot of males kind of oriented in the same direction. And then you have to stick your hand down in the sand and actually look around or feel around, and you'll feel a hard shell. So a female in this area will lay an average of 4,000 eggs per nest and an average of 20 nests per season. So she's laying on average 80,000 eggs per female. So lots and lots of horseshoe crab eggs coming into the Delaware Bayshore region each year. And so again, it's important to have lots of males to fertilize all of those eggs to ensure that the population can remain stable and grow. Maybe I already mentioned this but horseshoe crab peak spawning activity tends to coincide in this region with the new and full moons. So when the eggs are first laid, they're small and green and opaque. And then as they develop, they will get larger and more translucent. And you can actually, if you catch them in the right stage of development, you can actually see an embryo swimming around inside. I think Chris is the person that pointed that out to me for the first time in the field. This particular picture was taken by Dr. Emily Mung Douglas. She was a PhD student here at University of Delaware years ago, and now she actually works for Louisiana Sea Grant. She did her research with horseshoe crabs and said that she went to a beach after a storm event and found all of these eggs just strewn around the beach. So I definitely don't ever go to a beach and dig up a nest. But if you go after a storm event this time of year, you might get lucky enough to come upon these horseshoe crab eggs. Check out the rack line. That's where you would look for them. And now is the time to start looking. So eggs will develop across 2 to 4 weeks, and then they will hatch, and they'll spend about a week or two in the water column before they descend down to the bottom of the seafloor. And these are in habitats that are very close to where they were originally spawned. And then they'll start to molt. And we'll see the formations of a little tail start to develop. Horseshoe crabs are fairly slow growing. So this is a laboratory raised horseshoe crab at 9 months old and just a little bit smaller than the size of a penny. And then just 3 months later, this horseshoe crab has molted, and it's, I would say, about the size of a penny. It's not much bigger, so fairly slow growing, but they'll molt a lot in early development, and then they'll start to slow down to annually, and they'll molt, I think, average of 17 times or so until they reach sexual maturity, on average around 10 years. And that's because males sexually mature a little bit faster than females, and females will have an extra molt and that's why they're able to get bigger. Yeah, so they molt into adulthood. And they can molt after they've matured, but scientists don't believe they molt a lot. It's just maybe once or twice, and not all horseshoe crabs do it. So as they are maturing, they'll start going out into deeper water environments. Males tend to stay in the Delaware Bayshore region, while females are more likely to go out into the continental shelf. And then they'll start coming back onto our protected sandy beaches of the Delaware Bayshore region to spawn each year. So that's the background on horseshoe crab, their life history that I wanted to share. And now I want to talk about why horseshoe crabs are important, why we care about them. So horseshoe crabs have been really important for humans for a long time. Indigenous peoples use horseshoe crab hearts for tools. They used horseshoe crabs as fertilizer to grow crops, and that was a practice that was adopted by European settlers as well. So these are photos that were in the Delaware Public Archives, I believe from the 1920s. These were taken in the Bowers Beach area. And these horseshoe crabs have been piled up to be used to produce a fertilizer product. So this is a picture actually of a fertilizer processing plant in Milford, Delaware. And so horseshoe crabs were hit really hard around the turn of the 20th century. The industrialization of fishing practices, we see this in a lot of fisheries where these species were just harvested at really unchecked levels, and then we see a really quick precipitous decline, which I know that's a little bit faint, but that first bar there is the 1870s, and then by the 1880s, that's the second bar, it's really declined. And then we see this kind of gradual decline over time until we hit the 1950s and 60s, and there's very few horseshoe crabs being harvested. And that's not because there were any management measures that put in place. It's just because it was getting harder and harder to catch horseshoe crabs. There were fewer horseshoe crabs in the environment to remove. But horseshoe crabs continue. Oh, and I should say, so in the 50s and 60s, new products, new fertilizer technologies were developed. Horseshoe crabs are no longer used for that purpose. And but they do continue to be important for humans for other reasons. So horseshoe crabs are a really important bait resource for some of our local fisheries. Now, not so much the American eel fishery currently, but whelk is a local fishery that's still active. And horseshoe crabs are really good at attracting these animals. And so they're an important bait resource. And then horseshoe crabs are also important for the biomedical industry. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that horseshoe crabs have properties in their blood that allow them to isolate contaminants. And so there's a test called limulus amoebocyte lysate that is produced using horseshoe crab blood. And it is used to test all kinds of biomedical products like injectable pharmaceuticals, vaccines, so the COVID-19 vaccine, surgical implants. They all need horseshoe crab blood to make sure they're safe for human use. And so horseshoe crabs are collected by the biomedical industry. They are collected rather than harvested because they're bled and then actually replaced back in the environment after they've been bled. There is some associated mortality with this activity, and the kind of recognized mortality rate is about 15%, but there's a lot of unknowns there, right? There's a lot of unknowns there. There's not a lot of data coming out from the industry, but that's kind of the accepted rate that scientists use for modeling. And then horseshoe crabs, of course, are important ecologically. This animal up here, the federally listed red knot, I think goes hand in hand with the horseshoe crab and is just as important for the identity of the Delaware Bayshore region. And this area, it's not just red knots. We get near 1 million migratory shorebirds visiting our Delaware Bayshore beaches each year. The red knot, though, is so iconic, I think, because of its just incredible journey and the fact that it is so imperiled. This animal will migrate from its habitats in South America, stopping over in Delaware Bayshore beaches for just a few weeks. It stops here to refuel, to rest and refuel on horseshoe crab eggs. And then it will press on to its Arctic breeding grounds. And it needs to get up to those breeding grounds early in the season to be able to make it all the way through the season and really nice and nourished so that it can get through the feeding season. So I like to say horseshoe crabs need to get fat, and they need to get fat fast, and they do that with horseshoe crab eggs. However, the timing doesn't always work out that the horseshoe crab spawn is aligning perfectly with the timing of the shorebird migration. And so I just, as an aside, want to highlight that secondary prey resources are also really important for shorebirds. And those are found just in the intertidal environment, the rack line, that's where benthic invertebrates are. So in those areas when the shorebird migration doesn't line quite up with the horseshoe crabs, it's really important that we don't disturb those habitats for shorebirds. Okay, so managers got wise to maybe they needed to start implementing some measures to protect the species in the early 1990s. The first management measures were implemented voluntarily by New Jersey and Delaware, I believe, were the first, and they implemented just little measures like setting quotas and requiring licenses. And this was around the first time that the Horseshoe Crab Spawning Survey also began. But it wasn't initiated by professional scientists. It was initiated by community scientists. So there's a long history of the Horseshoe Crab Spawning Survey being rooted in community science. The first interstate fisheries management plan, so the first time that horseshoe crabs were managed across state lines through the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, was in '98. And those first management measures were specific to setting harvest restrictions for the states that were harvesting Delaware Bay horseshoe crabs. So Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey all received quotas, harvest limits, which had this, I think, unintended consequence of actually now allowing for a resource that was available to Virginia-based fishermen to come up into federal water, so that gray shaded area, and harvest those Delaware Bay population horseshoe crabs. So if you can imagine, there was a little bit of tussling between the states. They weren't too happy about that. So this IFMP was updated just a year later, and that's when coast-wide harvest restrictions were set. But I think it's an interesting story to tell because it created this political climate to support the establishment of the Carl Schuster Jr. Horseshoe Crab Reserve, which is that gray shaded area on the map where harvest is still restricted today. And then in this last IFMP, this is also when the Horseshoe Crab Spawning Survey became a standardized management requirement. So part of that IFMP was that science-based information needed to be collected to help inform horseshoe crab decision-making. And the managers recognized that there was this long-standing already data set that had been initiated almost a decade prior. And so they didn't adopt it exactly as it had been designed. They updated it to make sure the survey was standardized and scientifically rigorous. But again, rooted in community science. And now it still remains to be a requirement, a management requirement for horseshoe crabs. So I took the data off this because I keep seeing different numbers, but somewhere between '09 and 2013, horseshoe crabs started being managed through an adaptive resource management framework, which essentially allows for annually collected data, so new information every year, to be inputted into a model to then set harvest limits for horseshoe crabs. So these aren't the only data inputs, but these are some examples of the data inputs that go into that model, such as the horseshoe crab population estimates. Those don't come from the survey that I'm talking about. They come from primarily a trawl survey that's implemented by VIMS. Also shorebird population estimates. So there's a big, also, if you're familiar with the horseshoe crab spawning surveys, you might be also familiar with the big collaborative shorebird population estimate projects in the area as well. They do mark resighting. So they're capturing lots of shorebirds, they're putting flags on these shorebirds, and then they're resighting them, and that allows them to arrive at estimates, population estimates annually. And then the final one I wanted to point out is the male to female horseshoe crab spawning ratio. And that's because I'm highlighting that one because that's the piece of information that we collect through the volunteer-based horseshoe crab spawning survey. And again, important to have lots of males on the beach for every female to ensure fertilization. So just this year, the adaptive resource management framework got a facelift. The managers have been saying for a long time, or I should say the stock assessment scientists have been saying for a long time, that the software needed to be updated. So it's been updated, and that's allowed for some inputs of additional data sets that have been around and available for a while, but not inputted into that model. So some examples of new data are additional trawl surveys, and then mortality estimates. So mortality estimates from fisheries that are not from direct harvest. So sometimes when fisheries are out there collecting other animals, they'll inadvertently also capture horseshoe crabs, and there's some amount of mortality associated with that interaction. So That's all I'm going to say about the framework update. If anyone's interested in more information, I have a flyer up here from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission that outlines it really nicely, what all these changes are. Okay, so that brings me to the survey. Again, the survey is looking to document the male to female spawning ratio. And just to review, there's about 25 sites across New Jersey and Delaware where these surveys are implemented on 12 nights during the spawning season to coincide with May and June's full and new moon, a couple nights before and a couple nights after at the evening high tide. So it's not the same time across the season, it's the same tide across the season.
Can we interrupt with questions, or you want us to wait till the end?
Sure, feel free to ask a question.
I'm aware also that Center for Inland Bays does surveys. So I assume up and down the coast as we head south, like the Carolinas and stuff, they're also doing surveys?
So this is to manage the Delaware Bay population of horseshoe crabs. So if they're doing surveys in other areas, it would be to manage those population segments and wouldn't be going into the specific model. And I'm personally not familiar with how those animals are managed in other states. The CIB data do not go into this model unless there's been an update with that new arm that I'm not aware of, which is totally possible. But it's been the same 25 sites all this time. Ish, because sometimes there's not someone available to implement it, or there's flooding and you can't access a site a given year. Okay. So again, what we're doing with these surveys is to count the male and female horseshoe crabs along a kilometer-long transect. So, and we lay down 100 quadrats along that transect. So we don't count all the crabs on the beach along that kilometer. We break it down and then extrapolate. And managers are looking to see at least 3 males for every female. And so this graph kind of shows that we've had that level since '99, and that trend has been increasing. Okay, yep.
Why full moon and new moon? Higher tides?
Yeah, so I do think so. And it's associated with the oxygen in the sand and the grain size and that how all that lines up so that the high tide works out and it brings the horseshoe crabs in.
So they are more active. There are more horseshoe crabs laying more eggs at those times.
In this region, yes. It's not necessarily the case in other regions, but in the Delaware Bay region, they do see the greatest activity when all other conditions are the same on the full and new moons. Yeah, so there's other conditions that affect spawning activity like water temperature, definitely wind. So the energy on the beach, when it's really surfy, the horseshoe crabs can't get up onto the beach. So it's still, we don't always see the biggest nights on the full and new moon if we have stormy conditions.
Warmer water more.
Warmer water more. Yep. I like that. Okay. So now I'm going to transition into how we count horseshoe crabs. And I implement the survey at one site. It's Big Stone Beach. It's owned by Delaware Wildlands, which is Delaware's largest land conservation trust in the state. They own and manage 20,000 acres, and they happen to own the land where this survey takes place. I usually use students from like undergrad and graduate students in marine science and natural resources. And then we also get connected to some volunteers through our landowner as well. So if you're a DWL member, we did have a few folks join us this year from DWL. I have this web link up here. If horseshoe crab surveys interest you, there are other organizations that take volunteers from the public. Delaware Coastal Programs, I think, oversees 3 different sites. And then I know Delaware Nature Society through Abbott's Mill Nature Reserve does the Slaughter Beach site. It's too late for this year. And these are very popular activities. So if you're interested, keep an eye on it. I think a lot of times these trainings take place in April each year, and you do need to attend the trainings and go through the process and stay on top of it because they do get filled up very quickly. Okay, so on our site, we have a kilometer-long transect, and I meant to say, not every site does a kilometer. Most of them do a kilometer. Some are a little shorter, some are longer. but the scientists will standardize the results. And we don't do any of the data analysis. We provide it to the managers and they do it at the end. But so we will start at each site. Usually it's a kilometer long in the same kilometer each time. And we'll either start down bay or up bay. And that's randomly decided. So we have to I like to decide ahead of time because there's a little work to do. And I like to have extra time if we have to get all the way up the kilometer and then start the survey. But it's randomly assigned where we will be starting. And I bring 6 people out onto the beach and I break my surveys up into teams of 2. I model how I implement the survey off of Delaware coastal programs. So they do this very similarly. I think it works really well. So I really need 4 people on the beach and 6 is nice. So we limit it to that. We break the teams up. We just distribute a quadrat that's made of PVC. Everyone gets a clipboard with data sheets. And then headlamps are distributed. It's usually at night. Occasionally, we might have an evening high tide that's before the sun sets, but it'll set on us before we finish the survey for sure. And we assign roles. So they're pretty straightforward. We have someone that is responsible for counting the horseshoe crabs in their quadrat. We have someone responsible for recording the data. And it's very simple. It's just number of males, number of females per quadrat. And then the third person can help out managing the quadrat. Or if you can see in that photo, there's a lot going on there. And it can be nice to have someone backing you up and saying, yes, I do think that there are 4 males in that pile and 25 males in that pile, especially when the surf is coming in. We actually had pretty surfy conditions last night. So it happens. We had a good spawn last night. Nice. And then one of these people will also be the pacer. And I guess I should say the spotter or that third person can also keep an eye out for tagged horseshoe crabs. So these tags have nothing to do with our survey. They're put out by other scientists that have other research questions, but it can be very helpful to report them. They're answering questions like survival and habitat use and residency patterns and home range. So you can report those tags if you see them. So we don't prioritize that on the surveys, but if we have extra people out there, they can keep an eye out for them. But then one of these people will also be our pacer. So we have to know where to lay the quadrat. We set the quadrat down every 20 meters. And so instead of measuring 20 meters out, we will have everyone walk a 20-meter line and take the average of count the number of steps it takes them to walk that line and then take the average, and that's their pace count. So each team will record the number of male and female horseshoe crabs within this meter squared quadrat every 20 meters. But if we started everyone at the start line at the same place, of course, we would be counting the same horseshoe crabs up and down the beach. So we actually stagger their start. So I break our teams I break our crew into teams of 2. And so the first team will start in a randomly assigned location within the first 10 meters of that transect. And then the second team will start at a randomly assigned location in the 10 to 20 meter portion of the transect. So if you're on team 1, let's say your random start location is 5 meters. We can actually just roll the quadrat to find it 5 times to figure out where 5 meters is because it's meter square. And then team 2, let's say it is 12 meters up. And this isn't to scale, so don't hold me to that. But so they'll take their first readings at those locations. There's random assignments. And then from then on, they can just pace up the beach. The same number of steps. We have the same person doing it each time, just to make sure that people aren't off. I know I get really excited sometimes when my strides get too big and then I end up overshooting, but we tell people to just relax and walk calmly and you'll hit it perfectly.
How do they leapfrog?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of leapfrogging. It's ended up being, they can leapfrog. A lot of times it ends up that one team just stays slightly ahead of the other the whole way, but you're essentially leapfrogging in terms of team one is getting the first quadrat and the third quadrat location, and team two is getting the second and fourth. And we kind of move together up the beach. The horseshoe crabs are not evenly distributed across space and time, so we want to keep the teams together, because again, we start at when the high tide is estimated, and then we go, and then the longer we take, the further away we're getting away from peak spawning. So we try to keep things moving, but keep our teams together. If there's a lot of horseshoe crabs, it can take an hour. If there's not, it can take 20 minutes. So each team ends up doing 50 quadrats for a total of 100. And then I actually transpose the data onto a single sheet so that the managers don't cross their eyes. So we tell the volunteers to follow the crab line when they're placing the quadrats. So it's not a perfect line, right? The horseshoe crabs are a little bit uneven. Sometimes they're closer to the shore and sometimes they're further away. So when you get to your quadrat location, walking down, take a turn, here's the water, you'll approach the crabs wherever the crabs start. So you may be closer to the water, some on one quadrat and further away on another, depending on where the horseshoe crabs are. But we tell them never, ever to go this way or that way, which is very tempting if there's no horseshoe crabs where your quadrat is, and there are horseshoe crabs over here and horseshoe crabs over here. It's very tempting. It's hard. It's very funny how tempting it is. And so holding still the quadrat is really important because, again, things can be a little dynamic, which I think maybe you can see in that photo where we've got water just inundating the quad at that moment. So you're kind of like quickly counting, and you might have to do it a few times. We tell our crew to only count the crabs that are at least 50% inside the quadrats. And then another question we get a lot of times is, what if the horseshoe crab goes in and out of the quadrat? And my response is, you can do it either way, just do it the same way each time. So if you're always counting a crab that comes into your quadrat after you started counting, or if you do it once, you should always do it. And if you don't do it, it's fine. Just do it the same way each time. So one of the biggest things we have to train the volunteers on is being able to determine the males versus the females, which I think is probably the funnest part of the survey as well. And of course, it's very easy to take a look at the claws, but we don't want these horseshoe crabs to be disturbed in the middle of spawning. And so that option's really not available to us. So we have to look for other cues to determine males and females. So there are a few different ways you can do that. And one is just by looking at body size. If you get a really big horseshoe crab, you know it's female. If you get a pretty small one, it's male. It's a little bit harder to do that when they're more closely in size, kind of a medium-sized horseshoe crab, but definitely that's one option. Other clues, males have a curvature to their shells. Like they've evolved those claws to allow them to clasp onto the backs of the females, they also have curvature to their shells that give them room to be holding on to the backs of females. So the females will have more flesh, shell that's more flush to the bottom, and the males will have this concave shape. This takes some practice. I feel like it's working for me. It didn't work for me at first, but it's working for me now, and it can be very helpful, especially if you've got a horseshoe crab that's a little bit buried, but not super buried, and you're not sure about the size. You can actually put your hand down in the sand and feel around and feel if that shell is flush. But looking at it here, sometimes it's fairly obvious. And then, of course, when they're in plexus in this position, you can presume the female is in the front position and the male is in the back. Although last night we did see some males attached to other males, so you can't ever trust them. You cannot trust them. And I think I showed this photo already, but just some other examples of this. To me is so obvious what's happening here. There's a female and 3 males, and we don't we don't record an attached male versus a satellite male. I'm just doing that because I think it's helpful to kind of, and interesting to see, understand what's going on. With that said, I don't actually know that male is attached. I'm guessing. And then maybe we looked at this one too. This one's a little bit busier. And then this one I think is fun to look at because it's a little confusing. And this can be reflective of what we're experiencing in the field. I don't know, does anyone want to, does anyone see a female in this picture? Looks like maybe you're on it. Yeah. We got the female right there. Yeah, that's the female. And that's a lot of times what you're going to see. And there, I would actually probably stick my hands down in that other group of a pile of horseshoe crabs to see if there's something under there as well. But a lot of times that's all you'll see. And you might not see it at all. You'll just see there are crabs oriented towards the same thing, and you'll have to check. So these are all males. There's another horseshoe crab in here, right here. I don't know what it is. It's probably male. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to kind of share about the survey. I also just wanted to share another really neat thing I think about the horseshoe crab spawning surveys are they take place at night. So they get you out on a beach during a time that maybe you wouldn't normally be there. At Big Stone Beach in particular, because it's backed up by a marsh ecosystem as opposed to a housing community, we just get a really cool beach dune community. And sometimes we get nocturnal species like fox, we get Fowler's toad, mud turtles that you just wouldn't see on the beach during the day. And then all kinds of other, and ghost crabs and all kinds of other species that wash up. So it's pretty neat. So hopefully I didn't explicitly say it, but hopefully you've figured out when you can go see a horseshoe crab spawning event. You would, in May and June, and I would do late May, early June, find the new or the full moon for either. And then I would pick like a 5-day window. So like a couple of days before and a couple of days after plus the moon, and pick a good weather night where you have low winds, and try and get out there. And you pick a Delaware Bayshore beach, one that's public access. So maybe Slaughter Beach is a good example. And it's pretty cool if you haven't had a chance to see it. So I'll leave you with thoughts about what you can do if you want to help horseshoe crabs. And of course, the first is to look up a horseshoe crab spawning survey and see if you can get involved in one. Look out for tags, especially if you're out at night looking at horseshoe crabs. You'll be more likely to come across them because you tend to see more at night. And the tags right on them, they have a number, and then they also have the web address where you can report them. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they used to. The first time you report a horseshoe crab, they actually send you a pewter horseshoe crab pin, which is pretty cool. And then of course you can always help a stranded horseshoe crab back on its legs. Just do it by its head and never its tail. And I'll just mention that we just finished our first round of surveys. I blog about it. So if you visit our website, it's up here, the Delaware Sea Grant Horseshoe Crab Survey web link. You can kind of follow on and see how things are going at Big Stone Beach. I'll be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I'm wondering, have there been any studies pre and post development of offshore wind farms on the horseshoe population?
I know there's been some interest in the wind energy companies in looking at horseshoe crabs. I'm not familiar with studies that have been conducted already. Like, this is the population center, so I don't know that they would have necessarily been doing those studies in other areas where the wind turbines have been installed already. But I know, just based on conversations I've had, that it's on the radar. I just don't know more than that.
Thank you.
Good question though, if you're ever looking to provide public comment for the wind energy. Yep.
You showed some graphs that have a dramatic decrease in the population of horseshoe crabs from long ago. And into the 50s, it looked like that bar population was still very small. What's happening now? Are we improving?
Oh, yeah.
Stable?
Yeah. So it's all the way at the beginning of my presentation. So we are a stable population with an estimated 30 million horseshoe crabs in our population. And the stock assessment, the most recent stock assessment was conducted in 2019, and it's stable here. Most areas it's stable. I think in this, like across its range, the population is decreasing in New York. I believe maybe increasing in the Southeast, and then the other populations are all stable.
Okay. And I think the charts that you showed early on were quite a bit older in the early population.
Yeah.
But the timeline went back to, it looks like, a much larger population than what we're dealing with now.
That's harvest.
That's harvest.
But
So
it's harvest.
super rough numbers here because we're talking about the late 1800s.
Yeah.
But this graph is showing that horseshoe crabs are being harvested in the millions. So that graph is showing about 4 million. And then it went down to less than 2 million in the next decade.
Yeah.
So not population numbers,
Not
just
population, but
harvest.
some of that was because of the population decrease.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
I was involved in the making of a NOVA in the 1980s. We featured the red knots and the horseshoe crab. And I was told recently that the population had decreased dramatically. I guess that was of red knots, not of horseshoe crabs.
I couldn't tell you what it was, but yeah, the red knot population was listed in 2013, federally listed. So that would track. That makes sense. Yeah.
Listed as
Federally threatened, listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. Yep. So that
at the time it was not true. They were very populous. I mean,
in the 80s.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot more about red knots beyond the interaction with horseshoe crabs, but that makes sense. Yeah. Any other questions?
The sensor that they have that tells them when it's a new moon and a full moon, you know what frequency they're looking at? You know that? Or are they just looking at moonlight? But if it's moonlight, there's no moonlight, I guess they know it's a new moon.
So there's I think I didn't talk about horseshoe crab eyes and sensors because there's 9 of them, maybe 10 if you count the tail. There's a lot. Horseshoe crabs have a lot of sensors, and I haven't dug into that to be able to speak about it. So I'm not sure if it's light cues, but it wouldn't be light cues because of the new moon. It's probably lunar energy, the tide strength associated with the new and the new and full moons. Right.
Yeah, would increase.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Part of that.
Yep.
Kate, I used to track Manhattan populations as part of trying to understand striped bass population. And one of the complaints I've always had, and I've had my son was on Maryland Fisheries Advisory Council, is that we talk about stable populations, but these stable populations are sometimes only 5 or 10% of the historical populations. And so, we're letting the commercial and sport fishermen get away with murder, in my opinion, because if we would really clamp down and let some of these populations rebuild, the biomass that's in our fisheries would increase exponentially if we can let them do that. So I don't know if you ever get a chance to speak up in forums and stuff in the future. I'm getting old, too old to fight anymore. But it's just something to be aware of that, and the same thing with birds. I mean, our bird population, around the world is down.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a pattern we see. That's a pattern we see in the world we live in.
Right.
For sure. Yep.
Kate, when you were saying that they're the federal waters and beyond what when you said that they're harvesting or anything, again, I'm guessing if you're pulling out a crab, you're doing it for biomedical reasons.
No, so they're harvested, horseshoe crabs are harvested as a bait resource and also bait. So they're very effective at attracting whelk and American eel. So those are local fisheries that we have here that have depended upon horseshoe crabs. And then there are some international markets that eat horseshoe crabs, but I don't think they're eating Atlantic horseshoe crabs. There's some of the horseshoe crabs that we see in Southeast Asia are sometimes people eat them. And then I don't know that I need to get in the weeds here, but I think right now, mostly it's whelk. I think the American eel, there's not a lot going on right now with American eel.
And when they use them as bait, what are they using? Their underside, their organs?
They'll put the whole horseshoe crab in as bait. Yeah. So, and
I see, chop them up.
They can cut them in half. Yeah. And they stink.
And they
stink.
They stink when they're cut.
Well, they stink cut or not cut. They're
okay.
Yeah. Yes, Mark.
The couple questions from online. This one's kind of related. So Carla wanted to know what the limits are on taking horseshoe crabs.
Oh, off the top of my head, I don't know. They set the harvest limits every year, and I think it's been the same harvest package. I'm sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head.
Very specific.
Yeah, very specific question.
Do individuals fish with, or is it just in a company? Like, does a personal fisherman or whatever ever use that as bait, or is it always
commercial? It's commercial fishing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can have individual commercial fishers though.
Okay.
You drive down to Pilot Town Marina into Pilot Town Road. Sometimes the hunts are all stacked up. And then I guess in the spring, probably a couple months, they'll be taking those out into the bay. And then they sell the whelks to Europe, don't they? We don't eat them here.
I don't know about our whelks.
I think they send the eels to LA too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They eat a lot of things in Europe. We don't.
Although
in Asia.
As many sushi places we have around here, they'll take it.
Well, it's con.
They love eel.
They call it con. So.
Unagi.
Any other questions?
Oh, Mark.
So one more online, two more online. So Bob, and I don't know what's prompting this, but he's asking what happens when male to female ratio approaches 10:1. So you said they want to see at least 3:1. I guess he's wondering about an upper bound.
So these are all data inputs that go into the adaptive resource management framework, and then that informs the harvest package. So it would potentially be one of many data inputs that could influence the harvest package. That specific change, I couldn't tell you.
And then we'll just round them out. The last one, somebody said they joined late, and so they heard you say not to pick up the crab by its tail, but want to know why.
Oh, great. Great question. Yes, because the tails are very vulnerable to breakage. Horseshoe crabs won't hurt you. They don't have parts on them that can hurt you, but you can hurt them. So it's great to help a horseshoe crab that's stranded on its back. Just pick it up by its head, never its tail, because its tail can break.
I have another question.
Okay.
How old would this crab be? 2 or 3 years?
Well, but that's not a fair question, because do you think that crab is this big or this big?
Oh, yeah, no. Well, what I do
that was the scale.
For a couple of years, we had a molted shell about this size for the grandkids in a bowl of shells and whelk eggs and stuff. And the kids would play with it. It's subsequently become dismembered. And so I'm going to be looking this spring for a new one.
A new mold.
Because I still have little grandkids coming up.
Gotcha.
And so I was just trying to figure out how old they might be if it was this big.
Well, so males take 9 years to sexually mature, and females take, I think, 10. And then they don't molt much after that. So they would be you.
Probably 3 or 4 years old.
So if you're seeing horseshoe crabs on spawning beaches, they're probably mature horseshoe crabs. So they're at least, but your molts that you're finding, I don't know. Someone that is more familiar with their growth and development, like Dr. Emily Mung Douglas, whose photos I showed here today, could probably tell you, but I'm not. I administer Horseshoe Crab Spawning Survey. I don't do age and growth. Sorry.
Nice job, though.
Thanks.
Just
Yes.
to clarify, molt is when they're losing a shell. When they do that as often as
They shed their shell. See, you can almost see the fold here, up here,
yes.
where that's because it's the molt. Like snakes shed their skin. It's the same thing. They're just, when they get bigger, they shed their existing shell.
So that front will open up and they essentially walk out soft, just like a
I
blue crab.
see. And then, so do you see a lot of empty shells around? Like this
Sometimes.
gentleman is, thinking this, but it sounds like if they're doing it that often, like
Sometimes. So sometimes I think that, they're molting at sea. So it's something
I
that
see.
washes up onto the beach and then you get lucky beach combing.
I see.
So
Any other questions? Great, thank you, Kate.
thank you.
So that concludes our first of 8 Ocean Currents lectures this summer. Again, the next one is in 2 weeks, Thursday, June 2nd. It will be in person and online, and we have Dr. Jen Biddle talking about microbial forensics. So here at 7 o'clock, June 2nd, registration is encouraged. So please check out the website. Registration is required if you're going to do it online. Strongly recommended if you're going to do in person, which we love to see your bright smiling faces in person. So I think that's all I have. Mark, anything else we need to discuss? Okay. So thank you online folks. Thank you in person folks, and have a great night. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.